welcome in to Building the Board. Throughout this video series, we'll be talking about each position group, talking about draft prospects, as well as some free agency moves the Cowboys have already made and how those will affect the way Dallas will draft this year. I'm Danny Sarek, and I'm joined now by DallasCowboys.com writer David HELMAN to talk about our first position of this series, defensive tackle. Dave, it's no secret the Cowboys have focused on the defensive side of the ball throughout free agency so far, including the defensive line. They've tendered Antwaun Woods, and they've also brought in veterans Carlos Watkins and Brent Urban. How will those moves affect the way the Cowboys draft an interior defensive lineman?
You never want to say too much too soon, but I do think it's going to have a big impact because I look at those three additions you just mentioned. That's three free agents coming: Antwaun Woods, Brent Urban, Carlos Watkins. Consider that Neville Gallimore and Tristan Hill are already here. It says to me that the Cowboys are preparing for there not to be a defensive tackle, at least at the top of their draft board, and that honestly makes sense, which it's funny to think a year ago this would have been a prime spot to need a defensive tackle. Derek Brown out of Auburn was a top 10 pick. Javon Kinlaw out of South Carolina was right behind him. That guy's not really in this class. This is not a very top-heavy defensive tackle class, so to me it makes sense that you would try to cover your bases in free agency ahead of the draft.
I know there is one defensive tackle you like going early in the draft. Who is it, and what are his skills that put him so high up?
There's one name to know. His name is Christian Barmore out of Alabama. And listen, if you haven't seen this guy play, you can go see him wreck shop against the best of the best. Had absolutely dynamite performances in the college football playoff against Notre Dame and Ohio State. Really put himself on the board. He's big, he's disruptive. We always say you don't want to scout the helmet, but when you think about the defensive linemen that have come out of Alabama, whether that's Jonathan Allen, Daron Payne, Jerron Reed, pretty good group of guys to be in, and I expect Barmore to join that fraternity very, very soon.
Barmore was the 2021 Defensive MVP of the College Football Playoff National Championship. You touched briefly on some of the youth the Cowboys already have inside with Tristan Hill and Neville Gallimore. So when we look at days 2 and 3 of the draft, maybe a more realistic idea of where the Cowboys could draft a defensive tackle, who stands out to you?
That's the beauty of I'm going to let my guy Kyle Yeomans go into the one that makes me really excited. But that's the thing is, you know, we get wrapped up about number 10 overall, and understandably so. That's a pick that can change your franchise. But there is depth here, whether you want to do it on day 2 with pick 44, pick 75. The Cowboys have 4 picks in the top 100. There's a few guys that really pique my interest. Alim McNeil out of North Carolina State is one of them. Got to throw out a shout out to my LSU guy, Tyler Shelvin, just a mountain of a man. You want to talk about improving the worst run defense in the league. A guy like that could go a long way. But I've got one in mind that me and my buddy Kyle agree on that we're going to get into here in a sec.
Well, let's go ahead and hear what Kyle has to say. Kyle's going to give us a breakdown of a defensive tackle he has his eye on for the later days in the draft. Kyle?
Thanks very much, Danny. And Dave, yeah, you already alluded to it. Of course, this is one of our sweet spot guys when it comes to defensive tackle, and that's Tommy TOGIAI out of Ohio State. And it's not often that you really see these blue blood programs going all the way to Idaho to go and find a prospect. That's exactly what they did with Tommy. And you look at the size already, 6'2", 300 pounds. He's a guy that played a lot of 3 technique during his time at Ohio State, but they look at him as a nose tackle in his transition into the NFL draft. He was a 4-star recruit out of high school, and he didn't really waste a whole lot of time before playing up in Columbus. Started as a true freshman, then after a little bit of a grooming period, finally had a ton of production his final year with the Buckeyes. Let's take a look at that college football playoff that you guys already alluded to early on, saying, hey, if you're going to do it against the best competition. Well, that's what Tommy TOGIAI did in the college football playoff. Quite possibly had his best game against Clemson in the upset of the Tigers. And as we roll the clip, you can see already one of the strengths of TOGIAI is his upper body. He has some explosiveness off the line of scrimmage. He can eat up multiple offensive linemen, which is something that, of course, the Cowboys in the run game have lacked over the last couple of years. This time he's able to shake off a double team and tackle Travis Etienne, who we'll talk about, I'm sure, in this Building the Board series because, well, he's one of the top running backs in the league. But another thing that's a knock against Tommy TOGIAI is his length. He's got a little bit of shorter arms. He's somebody that's not necessarily going to jump off the page in terms of his length and athleticism. However, he's got a high motor and he's got a football IQ to look at. And here you see, of course, Trevor Lawrence in the back, quite possibly the number 1 overall pick or predicted number 1 overall pick. And despite the shorter arms, he still gets up and makes a play. He always is fighting for the football, trying to find a way for the Buckeyes to have some success off of that defensive line, and it's somebody who can play sideline to sideline. I compared him to Justin Matabike, who was a second-round pick last year out of Texas A&M, and somebody that I think, guys, if we look at it, this is somebody that can shore up the run defense for the Cowboys. And I think if you look at Tommy Togiai, right in that sweet spot of the third round, he's one of those guys you could look at.
Do not care about his measurables. The guy is a wrecking ball. Yeah. He is strong. He body slams people. That's what I'm looking at, man.
His lower body is something I know scouts are a little bit worried about. He's a little bit smaller. It doesn't really match the upper body in the strength, but he plays well with his hands. And despite those short arms, he does, like you say, have some leverage on his blockers, and that's something that I think they look for.
Round 3. Bring him on. Let's go.
Knowing there are talented players like Togiai projected to go in those later rounds, we've already talked about the youth and some free agency additions the Cowboys have made. Kyle, which pick do you realistically see the Cowboys using to draft a defensive tackle?
Well, I think Dave said it best early on. It can't be at 10. It really can't. That's a little bit too rich. I think if you're going to look at defensive tackle, it's going to be in the 3rd, maybe the 4th round. I would say the 2nd round, but with the premium day 1, day 2 picks that they've used on defensive tackle in the past, it'd be a little bit tough for me to look ahead and say, this is where they're going to pick them in a premium spot like that. I think it would have to be really 75, 99, and maybe on back into day 3.
That's a really good point that I think is worth mentioning is, and you can roll your eyes if you want to, but Tristan Hill seemed to be coming along before his ACL injury. Neville Gallimore really caught on in the second half of last season. Those are top 100 picks that they've already spent in the last 2 years. I think it gives them some leeway to wait on this, and that's why I would guess round 3, maybe 4 seems like the sweet spot.
From the players that we've talked about so far that have been on this big board behind us, Dave, who would you like to see the Cowboys draft?
Tommy Togiai. We picked him to highlight for a reason. The guy's a stud. If you honestly, other than maybe BARMORE, who like Kyle said, seems a little unrealistic for their placement, Tommy Togiai is like my next best scenario for sure.
I'll take a different prospect here. How about Levi Untitled from Allen? He's a Texas product, grew up right down the road and played with the Allen Eagles. He's somebody who has another high motor. He might be more of that 3 technique, and I know this Cowboys team is looking more for that nose tackle, that anchor of the defensive line.
And how much fun would that be to constantly say Unwuzurike for however many seasons to come?
We'll get it down. Don't worry about it. It sounds hard now. We'll figure it out.
Well, that's it for our defensive tackle episode of Building the Board. Be sure to stay tuned to DallasCowboys.com. We're going to cover every other position group. For David HELMAN and Kyle Yeomans, I'm Danny Surratt. Thanks for tuning in.